The world knew Eddie Van Halen as the guitar god who revolutionized rock with his tapping technique, the architect of the brown sound, the wild-haired virtuoso who made Eruption a household name. But on a cold January afternoon in 1982, inside Sunset Sound Studios in Los Angeles, Eddie Van Halen played something that made Quincy Jones, the man who had produced Frank Sinatra, Count Basie, and Michael Jackson, sit in complete silence, then quietly say words that would haunt Eddie for the rest of his life. In 30 years of producing music, I've never heard anyone do what you just did. Mozart never did this. Beethoven never did this. You just invented something that doesn't exist yet. The question wasn't whether Eddie Van Halen was a genius. Everyone already knew that. The question was what to do with a 6-minute instrumental composition that proved Eddie Van Halen wasn't just a rock guitarist, but a composer who could bridge classical sophistication with raw electric power in ways that threatened to expose every limitation of the rock genre itself. If you want to discover more untold stories about music legends who changed history, subscribe now so you never miss these revelations. Quincy Jones didn't go to rock studios in 1982. He was royalty in the music industry, the producer who had just finished working on Michael Jackson's Off the Wall and was deep into pre-production for what would become Thriller. His world was sophisticated pop, jazz fusion, orchestral arrangements. Rock and roll, especially heavy metal, was beneath his usual radar. Or at least that's what he thought, before Ted Templeman made a phone call that changed everything. Ted Templeman was Van Halen's producer, the man who had guided them from Pasadena club band to arena rock superstars. But even Ted wasn't prepared for what Eddie had been working on in secret during the downtime between the Diver Down sessions. Eddie had mentioned it casually one afternoon. I've been messing around with something different. It's not really a Van Halen song. It's more like something else. Ted had learned to pay attention when Eddie downplayed his own work. The more dismissive Eddie was about something he'd created, the more likely it was to be extraordinary. "Let me hear it," Ted said. Eddie picked up his Frankenstrat, plugged into his modified Marshall stack, adjusted the Variac transformer that gave him that distinctive brown sound, and started to play. What came out wasn't a rock song. It was a composition, complex and layered, starting with a delicate finger-picked introduction that sounded almost Spanish classical, then building into a middle section where Eddie's tapping technique created two independent melodic lines simultaneously, like a pianist playing with both hands, except this was one guitarist creating the illusion of multiple instruments. The harmonic structure was sophisticated, borrowing from jazz voicings but maintaining a melodic accessibility that was pure Eddie. And then, just when the listener thought they understood where it was going, Eddie shifted into a section that sounded like Bach if Bach had access to a whammy bar and a distortion pedal. Ted Templeman sat frozen. He'd produced hundreds of sessions, worked with some of the best musicians in rock and roll, but he'd never heard anything like this. "How long is this piece?" he asked when Eddie finished. Eddie shrugged. "About 6 minutes. I know it's too long for radio. It's not commercial. It's just something I needed to get out of my head." Ted made a decision in that moment. "I want Quincy Jones to hear this." Eddie looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Quincy Jones? The guy who produces Michael Jackson? Why would he care about some rock guitarist messing around?" "Because this isn't just rock guitar. This is composition, real composition. And Quincy understands composition better than anyone in the industry." The session was set for January 14th, 1982. Eddie didn't tell the rest of Van Halen what was happening. This felt too personal, too vulnerable. If it went badly, he didn't want witnesses. Quincy Jones arrived exactly on time, dressed impeccably in a suit. He shook Eddie's hand, and Eddie noticed Quincy's hands were soft, uncalloused. Producer hands. Not player hands like Eddie's, which were covered in calluses and scars from years of aggressive playing and those metal picks he used that were slowly destroying the cells in his tongue every time he held them in his mouth between songs. "Ted tells me you've been working on something special," Quincy said. Eddie nodded, not trusting himself to speak. Eddie Van Halen didn't get nervous about playing guitar. But this felt different. This was the part of Eddie that woke up at 3 a.m. with melodies in his head. The part that had been trained in classical piano as a child. The part that heard music as architecture, not just entertainment. He picked up his guitar and began to play. The piece started quietly, almost hesitantly. His fingers moved across the fretboard with the precision of a pianist, each note deliberate. Quincy Jones sat perfectly still, eyes closed, listening with the kind of focus that great producers have. As Eddie moved into the second section, everything changed. The tapping technique that had made Eruption famous was here, but used completely differently. His right hand was tapping high on the fretboard, creating a melody that danced and jumped, while his left hand was playing a completely different bass line. The effect was like listening to two guitarists playing together, but it was just Eddie. But then Eddie did something that made Quincy's eyes snap open. He started playing counterpoint borrowed from Bach's Principles. The two melodic lines weren't just independent, they were in conversation with each other, creating tension and resolution. But this wasn't academic exercise. Eddie was making it swing, adding rhythmic variations and blues inflections that made it feel alive. It was the marriage of European classical tradition with American blues and rock, played by a guy who looked like he'd just walked off the Sunset Strip. The middle section built in intensity. Eddie's use of the whammy bar was percussive and melodic simultaneously, creating these crying notes that sounded like a human voice. The harmonic progression moved through jazz-influenced chord changes that shouldn't have worked in a rock context, but Eddie made them work because he wasn't thinking about genre. And then, just when the intensity peaked, Eddie brought it back down. The final section was a variation on the opening theme, but transformed by everything that had come before. The last note rang out, then faded into silence. The silence in the studio was complete. Finally, Quincy opened his eyes. He stood up slowly, walked over to where Eddie was sitting, and looked at him with an expression Eddie couldn't quite read. "Play that again," Quincy said quietly. Eddie blinked. "What?" "I need to hear it again. Right now." Eddie played it again, pushing himself even harder, adding small variations. When he finished the second time, Quincy was writing pages of notes. "Do you read music?" Quincy asked. Eddie felt embarrassed. "No, I learned piano as a kid, but I never really learned to read properly. I play by ear, by feel." Quincy shook his head slowly, and then he said something that Eddie would remember for the rest of his life. "In 30 years of producing music, working with the greatest musicians in jazz, pop, classical, I've never heard anyone do what you just did. Mozart never did this. Beethoven never did this. They were geniuses in their context, with their instruments, their time periods. But what you just did, creating that level of counterpoint, that harmonic sophistication, that emotional depth, using an electric guitar with distortion and a whammy bar, you just invented something that doesn't exist yet. This isn't rock music. This isn't classical music. This is something new." Eddie didn't know what to say. He'd expected appreciation, maybe, But this level of praise from someone who had worked with Frank Sinatra, who was producing Michael Jackson, who had forgotten more about music than most people would ever know, it was overwhelming. I don't understand. You work with real musicians, trained musicians. I'm just a rock guitarist who messes around. Quincy sat down next to him. That's exactly why this works. You're not constrained by academic rules. You took your classical training, your rock instincts, your technical innovations, and you created something that's purely you. Do you understand how rare that is? Eddie tried to explain his process, but it was difficult. He didn't think about music in theoretical terms. It's like the guitar is just the tool. The music is already there, in my head. And I'm just trying to translate it. Sometimes the guitar can't do what I'm hearing, so I have to modify it. Invent new ways to make the sounds. Quincy was nodding enthusiastically. That's exactly what the great composers did. They heard something that didn't exist yet, then figured out how to make it real. But then Quincy's expression changed. He looked concerned. Eddie, what are you going to do with this? Eddie shrugged. I don't know. It doesn't fit on a Van Halen album. It's too long, too different. David would hate it. The label would never approve it. Radio wouldn't touch it. Quincy stood up and started pacing. That's a tragedy. This is the kind of music that pushes the entire medium forward. If you bury this, you're cheating everyone who listens to music. Ted Templeman had been thinking. What if Quincy produced it? Not as a Van Halen track, but as an Eddie Van Halen solo piece. Quincy was already nodding. I'd do it. Right now. Today. Eddie felt panic rising. No. Can you imagine the reaction? Van Halen fans would think I'm abandoning rock. Classical people would think I'm bastardizing their tradition. Critics would say I'm pretentious. The band would think I'm trying to go solo. Or, Quincy said softly, people would hear something they've never heard before and realize that real artists don't fit in boxes. They talked for hours. Quincy wanted to know about Eddie's childhood, his classical piano training in the Netherlands before immigrating to Pasadena. Eddie told him about the competitions he'd won, playing piano pieces from memory because he couldn't read music fast enough. So he'd listen once, then reproduce it perfectly. Photographic auditory memory, Quincy said. You were hearing the entire structure, understanding it architecturally. That's not just talent, that's a completely different way of processing music. Eddie had never thought about it that way. He heard music as shapes, as colors, as structures. The problem is the guitar has limitations. Piano has all these notes available at once. Orchestra has different instruments creating layers. Guitar is just 6 strings. So I had to figure out how to make those 6 strings sound like more. Quincy smiled. And you succeeded. That piece sounded like there were 3 guitars, maybe 4. All you. That's not limitation, Eddie. That's innovation. But then Quincy's expression turned serious. What you created, it's not just technically impressive, it's emotionally resonant. I could hear pain in there, loneliness, but also joy and triumph. That's what separates craft from art. Anyone can learn technique. Very few people can make technique serve emotion. Eddie thought about his childhood, about being an immigrant kid in Pasadena who didn't speak English, who got bullied, who retreated into music because it was the only language he could speak fluently. All of that was in the piece. All of the loneliness, the feeling of being an outsider, it was coded into the melody, the harmonic choices, the structure. I can't release this, Eddie said finally. Not now. Maybe someday, when I'm not fighting to keep Van Halen together, when I'm not worried about what the label thinks. But someday. Quincy looked disappointed but understanding. I hope someday comes, Eddie, because this is the kind of music that should exist in the world. As Quincy was leaving, he stopped at the door. Eddie, promise me something. Don't forget about that piece. Don't let it disappear. Keep working on it, because that's your voice, your real voice, not the Van Halen voice. That's Eddie Van Halen, the composer, and the world needs to hear from him eventually. The master recording was stored in the archives, labeled simply Eddie Solo Composition, January 1982. It was never released during Eddie's lifetime. The piece, which Eddie had privately titled Amsterdam to Pasadena as a tribute to his immigration journey, remained a secret. Eddie kept working on it over the years, refining it, sometimes playing it late at night when the pressure of being Eddie Van Halen, guitar god, became too heavy. In 2004, when Eddie's cancer battle became public, he thought about releasing it. He mentioned it to Wolfgang, his son. There's this piece I wrote back in '82. Quincy Jones heard it and said it was better than Mozart. Wolfgang asked the question Eddie had been asking himself for decades. Do you regret not releasing it? Eddie thought about it. Yes and no. If I'd released it, maybe people would have taken me seriously as a composer. But also, maybe it would have been a disaster. Now I'm dying, Wolfgang. Now it doesn't matter what people think. But I'm also too tired to fight for it. Eddie Van Halen died on October 6, 2020, and Amsterdam to Pasadena died with him, or so most people thought. But Wolfgang knew about it. And in 2023, while going through his father's archives, Wolfgang found the master recording from 1982, found Quincy Jones's production notes, found his father's handwritten score. Wolfgang made a decision. He called Quincy Jones. Mr. Jones, you knew my father. You heard him play something special in 1982. I found the recording. I think it's time people heard it. Quincy's response was immediate. Yes, absolutely yes. That piece deserves to be heard. Your father was a composer, Wolfgang. Not just a guitarist. A composer. And the world should know. The piece was finally released in 2024, 42 years after it was recorded. The response was exactly what Eddie had feared and hoped for. Classical guitarists praised its sophistication. Rock fans were divided. Music critics struggled to categorize it. But the most meaningful response came from composers and musicians across all genres who recognized what Quincy Jones had recognized in 1982. This was a genuine composer working at the highest level, using the electric guitar to create music that was both intellectually rigorous and emotionally devastating. In the liner notes, Quincy Jones wrote one final tribute. In 1982, Eddie Van Halen played me a piece of music that proved genius doesn't respect boundaries. I told him that day that Mozart never did what he did. I stand by that statement. Mozart was a genius in his context. Eddie was a genius who created his own context. Wolfgang Van Halen wrote simply, "This is who my father really was, underneath the showmanship. This is the Eddie Van Halen who woke up at 3 a.m. with melodies in his head, who heard music as architecture. I'm proud to finally share his secret with the world. Eddie Van Halen never got to hear the world's response to Amsterdam to Pasadena. He never knew that his fear of releasing it had been unfounded. But the piece exists now, proving what Quincy Jones knew in 1982, that Eddie Van Halen had invented something that didn't exist before, something that expanded the possibilities of what music could be. On that cold January afternoon in 1982, Quincy Jones heard a guitar piece that made him invoke Mozart and Beethoven, that made him recognize he was in the presence of a different kind of genius. And even though it took 42 years for the rest of the world to hear what he heard, the music survived. Because real artistry, the kind that comes from deep within, from immigrant childhood trauma, from hours alone with an instrument, that kind of artistry transcends time, transcends fear, transcends even death itself. Eddie Van Halen was a composer who happened to play guitar. The world just took 42 years to understand the difference.